Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Lependorf, Executive Director of the John Cage Trust, located on the Bard campus, although I'm actually elsewhere right now. And this is the kickoff of a new series. We'll probably do one of these a month. Actually, our next one will be February 11th, featuring Sue Schroeder, choreographer, and curator Hugo Worthy, who will be joining us from Leicester, England, and details about that coming very soon. So stay tuned, and lots more already set up. It's my great pleasure today to kick off Chance Encounters with John Cage to welcome Alex Ross. Uh, I think most of you here probably know who he is, but I'll give a little bio. He's, of course, was for years beloved critic of New York Times, music critic. He's the author of Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. Listen to this. And of course, the rest is noise, listening to the 20th Century, which won the National Book Critics Circle Award and was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He's also a MacArthur Fellow. And I think that's enough. I will simply say, welcome, Alex Ross.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
So you just published a really fantastic essay in the New Yorker. And for those who have their chat boxes open, I am pasting in, oops, that's not what I wanted to paste in. Let me try this. There we go. I'm pasting in some links to the piece in the New Yorker, as well as some supplementary things that go with it. Alex has very generously put some of his own research materials onto his blog. And so there are links to that as well as an earlier piece by Alex from 2010 about John Cage, which actually, for those of you who may not have read a lot about Cage but are interested, I think it's one of the very best primers out there. It's just a great overall portrait of John Cage and his work. So there's some great links there. If you don't have your chat box open yet, I will repost those links periodically throughout the hour. So Alex, you wrote about a figure that many of us have read about, but very little, Don Sample, who was Cage's first lover. There's a little mini chapter in Kenneth Silverman's very fine Begin Again biography, but there's not much there about him. And I think you probably have found out more about him than anyone else alive, certainly, who didn't know him personally. So let's begin just a little bit. Who was Don Sample and how did John Cage meet him?
Yeah, well, he has been, mentioned in Cage biographies and chronicles of his life. I think going back to the late 80s, sort of early 1990s, right at the end of John Cage's life was when his name really started surfacing. Cage mentioned him in a few interviews, and it became clear, although Cage was somewhat reticent about his personal life and discussing it in public. It became clear that this was his first serious relationship in the early 1930s. They met on the island of Capri sometime in the fall of 1930, I would guess, late summer, fall of 1930. It's not precisely clear when. Um, Cage had just gone on his first European trip. He had just turned 18 and was traveling on a sort of little bit of a travel fund supplied by his parents, his father having done well by his inventions in the recent years. Shortly, the money would dry up. Um, but and so he just wanted to go off and sort of have adventures in Europe. There was the idea of studying music and piano in Paris. A brief experiment with studying architecture, sort of also investigating the visual arts, sort of making a study of Gothic cathedrals in France. So he was really deciding on a direction, or I think really sort of investigating different possible directions, and just experiencing Europe as a young man. So he happened to be Don Sample on Capri. Sample was 10 years older, a Harvard graduate, a published poet, also an artist, who was apparently also traveling independently in Europe at this time, having done some few years of graduate study at Harvard. And they met and fell in love, started traveling together. They went to Mallorca, Algeria, a couple of places in Spain as well as elsewhere in Italy, and then returned to the United States together in the summer of 1931 and went to Los Angeles and spent several years together, living together in Los Angeles until the relationship ended, I would say, toward the end of 1934, the beginning of 1935, and they went their separate ways. And so almost nothing was known about what happened to Sample after that. Um, I became curious. This is really almost a sort of detour from a detour because I have been working for several years on a book about German-speaking emigres in Los Angeles in music, literature, film, architecture, all of the arts. And so when it comes to music, of course, Arnold Schoenberg is probably the biggest figure in the musical part of the narrative. And I'm particularly interested in telling the stories of these emigres about their relationships with the culture, the American culture around them, not to treat them simply as sort of these aliens dropped into a quote unquote wasteland, but people, some of them certainly really interacted with the environment, and there was a kind of mutual back and forth between these remarkable European figures in the Los Angeles context. And so John Cage and Arnold Schoenberg is one of the most extraordinary such relationships that developed as Cage studied with Schoenberg in the mid 1930s. And so I was digging around and sort of looking for traces of Cage in LA. I've been living in LA for a number of years, and so the sort of resources are somewhat to hand. The other thing that really struck me in terms of taking up this research is the sheer quantity of digitized materials that have become available. And I think everyone who does biographical research, historical research, has encountered this extraordinary explosion of digitized material, whether it's in the form of newspapers and magazines, or the kinds of documents involving immigration, census, birth and death certificates, sort of various other materials that you can find on a site like ancestry.com, where I've ended up spending a large amount of time. Um, and and so with this explosion of digitized materials, I think stories have opened up. So not only new materials regarding well-known figures, but you can actually take an almost completely undocumented figure like Donald Sample, and you can reconstruct his life fairly quickly, fairly easily, sort of making use of this material. So that's what I did. I mean, I just decided to sort of go try to find out what I could about Donald Sample, and fairly quickly had his date of birth and date of death and census giving his location, addresses where he lived in various places in Los Angeles later in life. And suddenly this life story kind of began to appear. And then I went to the sort of physical archives to sort of look for more for other traces. And so I went to the archives of Harry Hay. We can get into Harry Hay. Here in Los Angeles, and there's also an archive up in San Francisco. There are archives for people that both Cage and Sample knew, such as Gavin Arthur, who ran this fascinating commune up in Oceano in the dunes, north of Santa Barbara, or the Schindlers, R.M. Schindler and his wife Pauline, Richard Neutra, and so on. And it sort of turned into this fascinatingly kind of discursive, digressive expedition where I was trying to sort of gather as much as I could about Sample, and eventually decided to write this piece for the New Yorker about him, which is tricky because it is a lot of it is speculative. And with the fact checker, a wonderful fact checker, Anya Kordinsky at the New Yorker, we really pondered, how certain can we be about a lot of this when I'm trying to piece together a life story from just fragments and glimpses. So I did the best I could. I'm sure there's a lot that I missed. Um, but I think it is a fascinating story in and of itself of this adventurous, somewhat daring gay man who did not live a closeted life, and I think encountered considerable difficulties as a result of that. So just a story of gay life in the 20th century, but also, of course, it reveals something more about John Cage, reveals a little more about Harry Hay, who was a huge figure in the history of gay rights in America, really in the world, having founded the Mattachine Society here in Los Angeles in 1950. Went to high school with uh, John Cage at Los Angeles High, and also got to know Sample quite well. So yeah, so it's a detour that I went off on, and ultimately a lot of it had nothing to do with the book I was supposed to be working on, but it ended up sort of supplying this piece for the New Yorker, which I hope is sort of an interesting document in and of itself, as well as perhaps adding something to what we know about Cage.
No, it's quite wonderful. And I have to say, part of the joy of the piece is in fact separate from Cage or Sample. It's simply being able to see the path you took in trying to find out anything about this enigmatic
Mhm.
figure. And that's why I provided the links to the other research materials you provided, particularly the Santa Monica newspapers, where
Mhm.
just little mentions here and there, which of course are secondhand. So it
Right.
is all this overheard and glimpsed, knowledge
Yeah,
about
a lot of
them.
glimpses in the background, because no one, what, no one thought he was important, and yet, the interesting thing is, for a moment, I think in the early 1930s, this was an older man. He had gone to a prestigious college. He knew important people, had a lot of connections, and so, at this moment in the early 30s, he was this. I wouldn't describe him as successful, but someone who had a little bit of an aura of importance, that he might be going somewhere. And then he had these two much younger guys, um, whom he was sort of serving as a kind of tutor to. And I think this is a kind of relationship that you find in gay circles at the time, sort of very, very common. There was a sexual component to it. He and Cage were in a relationship together, but at the same time he was instructing these young men in the arts, in modernism, what modern was. He was a man who obviously had a very strong sense of taste. What was interesting, important, what wasn't, what was progressive, what wasn't. And I think that that progressive urge had an effect in different ways on both of them. A little bit in terms of the daring with which he lived his life, sort of having an effect on Hay, and I think his insistence on a progressive mentality in the arts having an effect on Cage. And this is sort of difficult to really ascertain, but I think we have some indications that Sample really may have played a role in pushing Cage into music, into sort of deciding upon music as a vocation. This is the sense that I got from a couple of these from accounts. Um, that Cage in 1930 and 1931 was dabbling in all kinds of things. I think really wanted to do it all. And when we're young, we think we can do it all. We think we can write a novel and write a symphony and paint and do all of that. And I think sort of Sample's influence was a little bit of sort of imposing direction and discipline. And so I think we have the sense that especially on Mallorca, they spent several months together on Mallorca, and and Sample was sort of telling Cage, this is the direction you ought to go in, which obviously in and of itself, if that is the case, and we can't really be sure that that's the case, that he played a very significant role in the history of music in the 20th century, by giving Cage that push. Of course, Cage needed only a little bit of a push to sort of carry on with his own energy and his own momentum in directions that I think Donald Sample ultimately probably had no comprehension of. I think, once he got to a certain point later in his career, it was a degree of avant-gardism, which I don't think Sample himself was all that interested in. Uh, but yeah, I think it's a kind of a nebulous figure, but not an unimportant one. But yeah, so I was saying that just these he's just sort of glimpsed in an ensemble with others. Um, and I think we owe it to Harry Hay more than anyone to sort of Harry Hay gave the most substantial recollections of what this man was like. You
Yeah.
know,
So maybe we could speak a little bit about Harry Hay, but also what I think is abundantly clear, it's that it's not so much who Cage is sleeping with we care about so much,
yeah.
but really this is about a very formative period, early, late teens. And some of Cage's lifelong interests seem to be introduced perhaps for the first time by sample. There's certainly a certain interest to sample that
Yeah,
are
yeah. Well, it was a kind of syllabus, sort of
yeah, yeah,
Sample obviously emerged from Harvard. The time that he was at Harvard in the 1920s, you know, Lincoln Kirstein was there, Virgil Thompson, of the whole group of people who were deeply versed in the arts, Hound and Horn, and so he would have come away. From Harvard with this syllabus, with the sense of, here's what counts. Here are the writers that count. Here are the artists that count. And so that was certainly something that he passed along to Hay. But I guess I sort of cycle back a little bit to the high school years. I happen to have the John Cage's high school yearbook here. I got it off of eBay, the blue and white from Los Angeles High. Um, there's a lot of signatures here. Unfortunately, John Cage did not sign this particular person's yearbook. That would have been a wonderful keepsake. There's kind of these very nice sort of Art Deco-ish illustrations. And so some of you may have seen this. This is the famous entry for Cage. Um, well, here he is right there. And it says John Cage. Uh, and the interesting thing is it's sort of in the form of an acrostic here. So it's Roman. Um, Romans, the team, LA High School team was the Romans. So R is for recreation, crafting. O, occupation, working. M, mischief, studying. Um, Aspiration to earn a DD and a PhD, a doctorate of theology, as well as
divinity.
divinity, as well as PhD, and most famously noted for being radical. And so we have the sense that of already at age 16, when he's I think he was only 15 when he graduated, 1928. Um, uh, and he's already had a profile, as someone who stood somewhat apart and was attached to radical ideas. Now, a kind of aside from the whole kind of Donald Sample business, something else that I stumbled across that I found very interesting um, was more traces of Cage's career as a high school orator. Now, we know this from the famous essay, the famous speech, Other People Think, which Cage delivered at a Southern California high school oratorical competition at the Hollywood Bowl and came in first place. Harry Hay was in the same society of high school orators. Um, he claimed to have won first place, but I found by meticulous research that in fact he only came in second place in his year. Hay was a year younger. Um, but what isn't so apparent, I think, from the way we've been sort of other people think, the same as the essay, which has been printed, um, a kind of pacifist statement that also advocates for cosmopolitanism and internationalism. This idea that America would do very well to be quiet for a time and listen to what the rest of the world has to say. A thought which is as relevant today, if not more so than ever. But this speech was delivered in the context of this network of world friendship clubs. Um, And this was a whole program for Los Angeles high school students that was launched by Susan Dorsey, the superintendent of the LA high school system at the time. Um, it was sort of both a kind of program for practicing oratory and sort of developing one's skills as an orator, but also to promote internationalist sentiments, pacifist sentiments, really among the school population. A very progressive seeming idea that Susan Dorsey promoted in this period. And so there are a lot of these clubs, and I found examples of sort of the World Friendship Annual, and you could read a number of the speeches that the students were giving. And I found another speech by Cage, which there's a link to that in one of those pages. I think it's actually a link to it in the main New Yorker article. But if you click on that, you can read what the other students were saying, which is really along the same lines. Uh, and and so I think sort of in this context, we see that yes, Cage was radical, but a lot of the other students were being radical in the same sense in terms of promoting these pacifist international ideas. And in fact, in this period, these ideas weren't so radical. Because in the wake of World War I, there really was this idea that we should never have any wars again, and we should, despite the rejection of the League of Nations here in America, we need to sort of promote vehicles of organizations for world friendship and de-escalating conflict and so on and so forth. And so it was a fairly, I wouldn't say commonplace idea, but a sort of a broadly accepted idea. And some of the other students' speeches are sort of equally forceful in the promotion of pacifist sentiments. Um, Interestingly enough, I found in a collection of essays by Upton Sinclair, the unswervingly radical novelist who ran to be governor of California on the End Poverty in California ticket in 1934. He actually attacked Susan Dorsey for this scheme of hers, and it's very interesting, sort of how he put it. He said, "All right, that's wonderful that theoretically wonderful that she's getting the students to sort of spout these pacifist sentiments. But this is all international stuff. This is not domestic. These aren't domestic issues. And the students are actually he thought that the students were being kind of discouraged from talking about sort of real domestic inequality, poverty, sort of issues of very immediate import, especially as the Depression arrived. Um, and even sort of suppressing that kind of talk in favor of these vague, lovely sort of pacifist sentiments. So that was Upton
Said that.
Sinclair's critique. That may be unjust. I do think Susan Dorsey was a remarkable woman, and I don't think it was at all conventional what she was doing with the LA public school system at that time. But in any case, the idea is that John Cage is not alone. When he gives that speech. What I found telling about that speech is not so much its content, but its style. The other students' speeches they're great, they're fine. That's wonderful sentiments. The Cage's speech has a rhetorical force and point to it that the other speeches lack.
Yeah,
And so
Cage
I think,
Cage does sound like Cage
yeah, he sounds like
very
Cage. He
early
sounds
on. Yeah.
absolutely like Cage. You know, there is a certain aggressiveness to it. There's a kind of unswervingness to it. So I think that sets them apart. Um, but I think, all this to say that it is very important to understand Cage in the context of LA, in the 1920s and 1930s. A very fascinating and complex world, extremely conservative, reactionary, frighteningly so in some ways. But there is also this very hardcore, determined bohemian, countercultural sensibility at work. There is a lot of artistic activity. Galka Shire, the promoter of painterly modernism, comes to LA in the 1920s. Cage develops a friendship with her later on. You have, even before Schoenberg, you have Henry Cowell organizing concerts here. You have Dane Rudhyar here offering his mystical dissonance. You have Richard Bulig, the extraordinary pianist and promoter of Bach and Beethoven and modernist music. So there was a lot for Cage to feed off of as he was sort of coming into his own. At Pomona too. There was a lot going on at Pomona. I went out to Pomona and looked at their archives and the student newspaper and realized, Cage didn't need to go to he didn't need to meet someone from Harvard, to learn about modernism. Um, and he had a roommate named Greg Anderson, who ended up working with Ward Ritchie, the boutique publisher, maker of extraordinary books here in Los Angeles. Greg Anderson was very up on literary modernism, and they together had copies of Transition magazine and some of the other modernist magazines. So although Cage himself said the sample had introduced him to Transition and thereby to James Joyce. Um, in fact, I think he would have already been aware of Transition at Pomona. And it may have been Sample who really insisted on the importance of someone like James Joyce and sort of pushed him to the forefront. But uh, yeah, so that a lot of this research that I was doing was to kind of restore a sense of the richness of the LA environment and the fact that so okay, they come back from Europe in 1931. Why didn't they go to New York?
Mhm.
Why did they go to LA? It seemed like New York would have been the obvious place to be. But I think, first of all, there's the fact that Cage had his parents here and sort of places to live. Sample the situation with his family, I think, was more complicated. But there was also this artistic environment that they could plunge into and make their name in. It's for two young men to kind of, seize the attention of, the New York artistic world in 1931. It would have been a little more of a challenge. In LA, it was a little more of an open field for them to move in. But I think that's telling that they decided to come to LA and try to make their names here.
I'd say it's so striking that in high school he's described as both radical and someone who might have been headed for a theological degree.
Right.
It's kind of remarkable.
Yeah.
And that really is Cage,
Yeah, yeah. No, there is that sense of him as on the one hand, radical, tending toward anarchism, but at the same time, a sort of ascetic, sort of almost priestly devotion to the task and the process and the discipline. So I think those are two sides to him, which in the end,
And also that famous early photo of Cage where he looks so straight-laced.
Mhm.
And Sample, of course, as you've written, was known as kind of a bad boy.
Right. Yeah.
No,
Well,
so
yeah, Sample, I mean, he was such an interesting character. And so what I discovered as I was just poking around in newspaper archives, was that he sort of grew up in Pennsylvania, Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania, right out of Pittsburgh, right outside of Pittsburgh. His family was wealthy. They were they had connections to steel, the steel industry. He especially had an uncle who was a multimillionaire who had worked with Henry Frick at Carnegie Steel and was just a millionaire many times over. Um, so he had the opportunities. But in high school, he got mixed up with a gang of teenage auto thieves. And I found a whole string of articles, just kind of unbelievable kind of series of incidents where not Sample, but a couple of the others went on to really become sort of full-time, bank robbers and sort of outright, criminals. Sample, I think his family swooped in and sort of extracted him, I think, made sure that he didn't necessarily face the charges that he might have deserved in terms of the car theft ring, shipped him off to a Christian Science boarding school in Missouri, hundreds of miles away. And then somehow, he went to he went to the University of Pittsburgh for a year, and then somehow he ended up at Harvard. And how that was accomplished with a criminal record, I don't know, but I guess
It's
that.
really striking. And one can only wonder how that happened. And also that he was doing a literature degree with a little excursion into law, but focusing on poetry. And we only can see a little bit of poetry published then, and you give us a bit
Yeah.
in the article. And it's not particularly striking poetry, but
No, no, it's not very
later
good, honestly. I mean, it is a
it,
college poem,
it's not.
so
But
it
later
has,
he's described as being like E. Cummings, of which there was zero inkling in
yeah.
that early
Well, that
stage.
was, I mean, it's a bit tantalizing, but Pauline Schindler,
Mhm.
who was a very remarkable woman with whom Cage, as I'm sure many of you know, had a brief,
Yeah.
passionate affair right between, right after the sample relationship and right before he married Xenia. Um, the wife, eventually ex-wife of the architect R.M. Schindler, a significant critic and sort of tastemaker in her own right. She briefly edited an extraordinary magazine called Dune Forum. There are only 5 issues of Dune Forum, but you can find it on the internet. And it has a very early essay by John Cage. It has a very significant essay by R.M. Schindler titled Space Architecture, which kind of sets out Schindler's architectural philosophy. There's a work by Cowell there, the photographs by Ansel Adams and Edward Weston. It's a remarkable publication, but what I found in Pauline Schindler's letters was her extolling this remarkable poem that she had read by Donald Sample, which she said was better than E. Cummings.
Right.
She said it was like E. Cummings, but it had more heart, more substance. I forget the exact words. But there's no trace of this, unfortunately. Whether this was just Pauline perhaps getting a little carried away, sort of with praise for her young friends, or whether there really are these sort of great lost poems by Donald Sample, I don't know. But yeah, unfortunately, the college poem doesn't really give us much of an inkling of that. But it's a funny artifact in and of itself.
Oh, it's great. It's great. Similarly, you write about the two of them, Sample and Cage, having a joint art show
Yeah,
of which we can't see anything.
alas, yeah. Um, they did a number of these sort of exhibitions slash performances together in the early 30s, mainly in Santa Monica. And then Donald Sample had a little solo show of his own at the Santa Monica Public Library, which got a positive, very brief but positive mention in the LA Times from Arthur Miller, the chief art critic, who was had a discerning eye. So there was something there. Sounds like he was making a sort of expressionistic, sort of German expressionist woodcut style kind of pieces. Um, there's a whole list of titles of these pieces. I tried writing to the Santa Monica Public Libraries or various other towns. There doesn't seem to be any trace of it. There are no relatives of Donald Sample that I was able to track down to whether sort of anything of him remains. Alas, it does all seem to be gone. But the point was, yeah, they were making work together. John Cage was himself making artworks. There was also an exhibition at Scripps College right after they got back from their trip in late 1931. Um, and then Cage was also performing, playing his own music and performing um, other works, especially contemporary works. And their little activities together drew some notice in the press, and in particular this publication, the Santa Monica Outlook, which is a I had such a good time looking through back issues of the Santa Monica Outlook. They've been digitized by the Santa Monica Public Library, actually. And there's a page called Of Interest to Women. And basically everything Cage and Sample did together appeared under the rubric of interest to women. Um, and I found there descriptions of almost every one of the series of 10 lecture performances that Cage gave at his bungalow, this bungalow in Santa Monica on Alta Avenue, where he was sort of the live-in gardener. and they had a space over a garage where they used as a studio. And they invited people to attend, their Cage in particular, to attend his lectures and performances. And it was a kind of introduction to modern music. And so
And I
we
have to
get
say,
the
you list some of the topics or the
yeah
composers he talks about, and some names pop out in some surprising ways. The idea of John Cage giving a talk on Ernest Hawkes' probably geographical fugue, and Poulenc, even Stravinsky at this
yeah yeah
time.
yeah
He's perfectly positive about, even though he's a Schoenberg disciple, and that
yeah
changes later. And the idea that he performed Gershwin's three preludes is just
right yeah
incredible, absolutely
yeah
incredible.
and Cage was a good pianist. I think he liked to sort of build up the myth of himself a little bit as a non-musician, or sort of someone who sort of was outside of sort of the conventional musical world, um, and sort of wasn't interested in sort of conventional musicality. But in fact, he was a trained pianist, not a virtuoso pianist, but good enough to be able to play the Gershwin preludes, which are not simple, especially if you're going to do them in a stylish, elegant way. Good enough to play Schoenberg. I found there's another letter by Pauline Schindler I came across saying, like, I've never heard anyone play Schoenberg the way Cage does. Um, and and Pauline Schindler had heard Richard Bulik play Schoenberg, and Bulik gave the premiere of Schoenberg's Klavierstücke Opus 11. This is someone who was very, very well versed in Schoenberg, but Pauline said no, Cage's Schoenberg was the best. Um, and so he was a skilled pianist, and do I have this? Let's see if I can find the. There was a publication that. Hold on one second.
Yeah, go ahead. And while you're looking for that, I'll say, and you mentioned this in your piece, that Sample kind of
Oh yeah.
made Cage spend time composing. Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there was a publication called Das Neue Klavierbuch, and so um, Cage came across this during his European trip, not in Germany. I'm actually not sure that he made it to Germany. Um, Sample was definitely in Germany. I'm not so sure that Cage made it. He did also not attend the premiere of the talk's Geographical View. Unfortunately, that is that is something that my research in the immigration records showed that it's impossible for Cage to have attended that performance. But he knew about it, he heard about it. But he probably came across this in Paris. It seems as though he went to see John Kirkpatrick after John Kirkpatrick gave a recital that included pieces by Stravinsky and Scriabin that made a great impression on Cage and also really helped propel Cage toward a career as a composer. And it seems as though Kirkpatrick recommended or was talking about these books of they're not quite sort of children's collections of sort of children's pieces, but they are less difficult, sort of modern music for pianists of more limited ability. But what you find is when you look at the names of the pieces that are listed in the Santa Monica Outlook that Cage was performing at Alta Avenue in 1933, a lot of these pieces are a lot of those pieces are in these collections. So I think it's Cage was working from these publications. Not only these, there are other pieces that weren't there. Um, but this was sort of how he taught himself what was going on in contemporary music. It's very interesting. But it's a fascinating overview that he gave. It's very ecumenical. It's not from any particular kind of ideological camp. There's Schoenberg and Stravinsky. There's Poulenc and Satie and Copland and Gershwin and the Germans and Hindemith and Talk. So it would have been a very good and instructive and informative picture of the state of contemporary music for those audiences in Santa Monica. Now, several times, Cage referred to this audience as the housewives, the Santa Monica housewives. I don't think this was fair of him. Um, possibly he got a little bit of a complex about having all his events listed on a page titled "Of Interest to Women" in the Santa Monica Outlook. Um, uh, this was probably a mostly female audience, but this was a sophisticated group. These were people who were constantly attending lectures and talks and performances and sort of all aspects of what was going on in the art world and intellectual life, and to sort of classify them as housewives. Catherine Parsons Smith, an important scholar who worked on musical life in Los Angeles in the early 20th century, complained about this to some extent in an essay that she wrote about Cage and Mary Carr Moore. Um, but I think this audience was encouraging. I think they were eager to learn, and they supported Cage at a very early stage of his career, and I think we should be thankful that the sort of Santa Monicans in that period had sort of were.
So it seems like he really had two support groups. There's these cultured ladies who are attending these informal talks he's giving, and there's
Mhm.
also this, gay coterie for the most
Yeah,
part.
right.
So
Yeah.
maybe let's dig back into that a little bit. Let's back up because I think not everyone may know as much about Harry Hay. They knew each other in high school, and I'll let you tell it, but Hay has a very important place in the history of cage performance, which is surprising to those who even, I think, know about Harry Hay, who founded the Mattachine Society and continued to become a radical fairy and so forth. But at this point in high school, he has
Yeah,
connected
well,
the
this was
cage
after high school. That
right
they didn't
after
actually
that.
know each other very well in high school. But interestingly enough, I think Cade, sort of being a year older, served as a little bit of a tutor or advisor to Hay for his oratorical activities. But they didn't know each other well. Neither was out as gay. I think Cage had yet to have any kind of sexual experience, and I think all of this was sort of in his future. Um, when they came back, when Sample and Cage came back, late 1931, um, they got back in touch. Um, Now, Hay tells a very long and elaborate story. Hay was a great storyteller, as Cage was. And when you read these stories, you have to be a little cautious about, buying into sort of all of the sort of richly appointed detail that he was recalling, from over, 50 years later. Although Hay did have a very sharp memory in a lot of ways. So when I found a lot of these little references that he would drop, actually, they would track quite well with the documentary record. Um, but they got back in touch, and Cage went over. Harry Hay went over to the place where Cage and Sample were living together in Santa Monica, and he found them insufferable. And he said they were sort of posing questions and kind of sneering at him or sort of just kind of silently judging him, and he found it a very unpleasant experience, and he went back home, and so I'm never going to see those people again. And his mother said, "Oh, this John Cage has been trying to call you. You have to call John Cage back." I can't stand the guy. I don't want to call him. And he calls Cage back, and Cage says, supposedly, so you passed the test. So it was also some kind of like, hazing, gay hazing ritual, that he was subjected to, and he passed the test, and so he started hanging out with them a lot. And then it turned out that, they were looking for someone to sing some of Cage's very early pieces, and I guess they happened to hear Harry Hay sing something, and he had a very good voice. I think he's in one of the musical groups here, in the high school yearbook, um, and so Hay was the soloist, for a couple of those early Cage pieces. The manuscripts of we still have access to, thanks to Hay having kept them. And Gertrude Stein settings and these
The group, yeah.
Greek
Yeah.
odes. Odd music, kind of a little bit hard to sort of get a grasp of what exactly Cage was after in these pieces. They're a little bit they strike me in a way as a little bit like absolutely humorless satire. You know, they're just very strict and stripped down and kind of chant-like and severe, but certainly, very interesting as documents. And so Hay was singing. The way Hay told it, he recalled a particular performance at this, what he called the Santa Monica Women's Club, which would have been the Santa Monica Bay Women's Club. Um, I looked for traces of some kind of benefit or performance at which they might have participated and couldn't find any. I did find, however, Cage and Hay appearing together with their friend Cornelia Mall, who's a pianist and a dancer, at a meeting of the junior Republicans, I believe it was, um, group on the eve of the presidential election of 1932. So this was Herbert Hoover running for re-election, and this was a kind of get out the vote event. Although it was sort of a it was more kind of everyone should go vote no matter what your party was, but it was a Republican event. Um, they performed, I don't know what they performed. Did they perform? Did they perform these strange hieratic Greek odes? This Herbert Hoover kind of, I don't know, it's very
Imagine.
odd. But
Or it was an evening of Stephen Hawking.
when you're a young artist, you take whatever opportunities you get. I
Wow.
mean, both Hay and Cage, they both came from Republican families, and although I doubt they at that stage were Republicans themselves, this was the social circles that they had access to, so they took the opportunity to perform there. This woman Cornelia Mall was also very important, I think. I suspect that she is the reason all of these stories are appearing in the Santa Monica Outlook.
Right.
Uh,
Interesting.
Cage's mother, Lucretia Cage, had, connections in the newspaper world. She would end up writing for the LA Times. But the Mall family, they were the Santa Monica family, and I think she's the reason why their activities received such lavish coverage. But it's a fascinating document to have of just what Cade was doing week by week,
Yeah.
in that crucial
And also,
period.
you're right about, I mean, the title of your piece, The Sad, we can maybe even say demise of Don Sample from what we know. But also, Hay is someone who, like Cage, becomes quite famous in his own right.
Yeah,
And yet they have virtually no connection after these early days.
yeah. Well, okay, just sort of go through a little bit the history with Hay, the subsequent history with Hay. Um, he was very interested in the arts. He was also moving toward politics, not gay politics yet. In fact, communist politics. He became a member of the Communist Party, and that was his sort of primary preoccupation in the late 30s. Going into the 40s, he moved to New York and then came back later. Um, um, but at this stage in the 30s, it was about artistic bohemianism mixed with sort of discovering oneself as a gay man, exploring these fairly open circles of gay life in LA in this period. Um, older, there were older figures whom they could have associated with, um, and uh, and then, there was a sort of there was a kind of a crossroads for each of these three men, you know, um, and the pressure to marry and to settle down and to sort of present a conventional facade for a man who was moving through his 20s was very strong. I think there was pressure from Cage's own family in this regard. With Hay, actually, interestingly enough, I think the pressure to become more conventional came from the Communist Party, which was not a gay friendly environment by any means. Uh, and so there was sort of pressure there, sort of oddly kind of bourgeois mentality for sort of among sort of communist circles, but there's no great contradiction there in the end. Um, and Sample was the one who did not marry and settle down. Now, Harry Hay says that sometime around 1934, 1935, he was arrested for cruising, was caught with another man in DeLong Park in Hollywood. I went to the court records and went through all the kind of different things. The records have been destroyed. There's no long gone. There's no record of such an arrest. It's perfectly plausible that such a thing happened. Um, and uh, and furthermore, Hay indicates that Don Sample was physically suffering,
Mhm.
that he had developed sores, that he was sort of physically, in poor physical condition after going to prison or whatever he had gone through, and that his Harry Hayes' mother actually nursed him for a period. Um, After the relationship with Cage ended, there was basically no contact between them, as far as I can tell. But Hay and Cage, Hay and Sample remained friends, and Sample was famous for giving these wild parties at a place that came to be called Homo Hollow in Laurel Canyon.
Can I ask you about that? Talk about the crossover with Schoenberg here is just unbelievable. It's really unbelievable.
Well, this is this was just an odd, maybe nothing more than a coincidence, but it happens that the same address that's associated with Homo Hollow, which Sample did live for a time, that's in the census record or the voting records. um, I'm not sure exactly what train of just kind of fidgety you know, procrastination kind of led me to stumble across this fact, but I realized that same address is associated with a man named David Patterson, who was friends with Schoenberg when Schoenberg first moved to LA, invited Schoenberg over to his house in Laurel Canyon, um, what he called his bachelor pad in Laurel Canyon, and wrote up this whole affair in this wonderfully odd, kind of amusing account of, Schoenberg came to dinner at my house and sort of associated with my young gay friends. And whether I don't have any explicit evidence that David Patterson was gay, but reading between the lines, it doesn't seem like a kind of a implausible assumption to make. And so Homo Hollow, there was like several units together, kind of. It was a sort of a house or a couple of houses sort of together, and it's still there. And so there would have been studios, sort of, different units, sort of maybe 4 or 5 people sort of living there at different times. Uh, but yes, Schoenberg did show up at this place. I think probably shortly before Donald Sample was living there, and
McKenna, wondering, I mean,
fun
was
mental
he
picture.
clueless about the Bachelors or was he just okay?
Schoenberg was now it's interesting that Cage got married right before he started studying with Schoenberg.
Right.
Now this may be this is pure speculation. Um, did Cage feel that he might need to become a little more conventional in his lifestyle as he went to study with this gigantic, influential European figure? I I don't know about that. You could also argue
Hard to
that
know. I
he
mean, I
he
think
he,
that's what
he
one could
genuinely
consider.
was in love with
Oh, he
Xenia.
absolutely
That was
was.
it was a
Although, of
real
course,
relationship. So, um, but the fact was, he may have thought, but it may have been a possible factor, in this kind of uh, that he felt that to be a sort of unattached,
yeah.
potentially gay man,
Yeah. I mean, I
might
believe
have
he really loved Xenia, but at the same time, during the
yeah,
10 years of their marriage, he's also developing his relationship with
right,
Cunningham.
yeah.
So,
But in any case, if he had that worry, and I have no idea whether he did or not, it was unnecessary. Schoenberg had no problem with gay men. There were a number of students around him, several students around him in LA who were gay. There's Lou Harrison, of course.
of course. And he's
Um,
probably playing tennis famously with Gershwin, Schoenberg.
yeah, well, Gershon wasn't gay,
No,
but
no, no, I know, but I mean, again, two colliding
yeah, yeah,
worlds.
right,
That's
yeah,
what
yeah.
I mean.
No, but there were several other gay men who there was that what was his name, who ended up becoming a photographer and took the famous photo of Truman Capote.
Oh,
Does anyone in the chat
yeah. So I'll pop it in
remember?
the chat if you know.
Yeah, yeah. Uh, um, took the famous Truman Capote as a very young fey man,
Hmm.
this very sort of seductive glance at the camera. Um, and so yeah, there are a number of, and of course, Cage Schoenberg came to Cowell's defense.
Yeah.
Um, the extraordinary thing that he said about Cowell when he was in prison was sort of this critique of questioning conventional morality and
Mhm.
quoting Hamlet. There may be more things that are dreamt of in
Mhm.
your philosophy, which was a very, he was a follower of Karl Kraus, and Karl Kraus was very, very strongly opposed to conventional morality, including homophobia, in his writings. So that was something he would have inherited from Karl Kraus. But nonetheless, yeah, this was not an issue with Arnold Schoenberg.
And also, there
Whatever
does
other whatever other hang-ups Arnold Schoenberg had,
it is amazing, but
this
it
was not
seems
one of them.
there also seems to be a kind of, and I don't know how prevalent it was throughout Los Angeles at the time, but at least in the circle the Cage is in this sort of coterie, there's a general sexual openness or promiscuousness. You write even about them being more or less in a throuple for a
Yes,
period.
this was another odd kind of avenue that I went down. But they spent a little bit of time at the famous Schindler House
Yeah.
on Kings Road, which is still there, and anyone who hasn't seen it should go see it. It's just an absolute monument of early modernist architecture, open to the public, and so Cage recalled living there for months or even a year. Um, but the records, the Pauline Schindler's papers suggests that officially the two of them, Sample and Cage, were there for only a few days or a little over a week. Um, and so one way to resolve this contradiction is to realize that, in fact, they were in this odd relationship with this German-born figure named Erich Locke, who was working for Ernst Lubitsch, the director at the time, and living at the Schindler House. Harold Hama, that's right. There you go, Harold Hama.
The photographer.
That's the photographer. Um, and so I think for a period of months, they were regularly dropping by the
Mm.
Schindler House, and sort of they were in the environment. It was a big commune anyway. People were constantly going in and out. Um, but it must have been a lively
Yeah,
must have
but
been a
also
lively
they
period.
really it's this circle of hyper artistic
Yeah,
friends, some of whom are sleeping together or not, but that are
right.
influencing one another.
Yeah,
I mean, even back to transitions, we're going to have to wrap up in just a moment, but the poets he was reading or the writers in transitions back then, Stein, Pound, um, Joyce, are for the most part the writers who remained important to him through his entire career.
right. Yeah.
It's really something.
Yeah, and when you think about the syllabus, again, this idea of, Cage sort of deciding very early on what was important to him and remaining fixed on those points of reference, even as a sort of musical and artistic universe sort of opened up, in extraordinary ways and kept opening and kept opening. But there are these sort of absolute reference points. Joyce was one of them. You know, Satie was one of them. Um, Schoenberg, of course, for all the tension and complexity of their relationship, was one of them. And I think it's just exciting to see these moments at which Cage was finding these points of reference and really sort of experiencing them and internalizing them for the same time at the same time. And 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 this is where a figure like Donald Sample is so important because he he really helps to sort of draw Cage's attention to these figures, or in the case of course, he knew about Joyce and Stein. Before he went to Europe, you can see him imitating Gertrude Stein in this crazy story that he wrote for the Pomona literary magazine. Um, but it's someone like Sample who sort of connects the dots, and sort of shows how these figures uh, fit together and encourages. So even if he's not introducing Cage to such figures, he's encouraging the interest. He's not rolling his eyes or sort of shrugging,
Yeah.
he's
No,
saying,
it's really, if
yes,
anything, yeah,
yes,
he's
pursue
darkening the
that,
dots.
you
Yeah.
know. So I think, Sample was, he was just a great he was a teacher, advisor, editor, someone that you sort of bounce ideas off of. He became a school teacher himself later at the San Rafael Military Academy. This is another, you could read the piece. The Sample story goes on and takes all kinds of twists and turns, and it gets rather sad, and even a bit grotesque in places. And the second relationship that he may have had with a young man who came to a ghastly end, and then finally he became sick, really, I think bedridden, in his later years, with some kind of condition, a neuromuscular condition of some kind. But uh, yeah, so he was a school teacher, and you can just sense this. You can just sense this. The way certain great teachers can encourage and criticize in equal measure, and sort of shape your 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 discipline, in that way. And so I think Sample was one of Cage's important teachers in that respect.
Yeah. So with that, I'm going to thank you for doing this remarkable bit of sleuthing and research. If anyone has not read the piece, of course, rush and read it. It's just full of just amazing little tidbits. And the other links I provided, if you're watching recording later, I'll put them below, hopefully. Um, Alex has shared some of that Santa Monica research, which is just remarkable. That the concordance, the footnotes to the first piece are really something. And there's some images there as well. And it is incredible to think of what is available to anyone now digitally
Yeah,
if you know where to look. And
exactly. That's the thing. I mean, I don't. This was ultimately no kind of, this was easy to do, to some degree, if you knew where to look, just because of the wealth of materials that are now available. And I think there's so many more stories like this, waiting to be discovered, and much more to be discovered about Cage himself, you know. But to sort of get away from the kind of narrative that in which sort of only, certain great figures matter, and just in terms of looking at a whole artistic community, such as existed in LA in the sort of 1930s, you can just pull more of it together, and you can just tell more of the stories, because, you know, there's this winnowing out that happens, and we just end up focusing on certain names. And of course, we are right to focus on John Cage, in this context, but to sort of fill out the picture as much as possible.
yeah, no, it's beautiful to be reminded that the non-famous people in famous people's lives might be very important, and
Yeah,
especially at this formative age.
yeah,
We've come to the end of our time, and there's so much more. I wish we could just talk to you another 2 hours, but we're going to end it there because we want to leave them wanting more. And Alex, thank you so much for being with us to start this series.
sure. And I just want to say I saw Mark Swed's name there, and I want to thank Mark. Yeah, I talked to him several times as I was undertaking this research, and his responses were very important and helpful, and I'm very grateful to him.
And I should say I've warned Mark that I will drag him into one of these later. So we'll
Yes,
hear from
absolutely.
Mark Strat.
We'll be there for that.
So amazing research. A lot more lined up. I hope everyone will join us next month. I'll have an announcement pinning it down right now, going out very soon, and other ones lined up as well. Um,
Lucas and
I,
Brown. Oh my
yeah,
God.
oh yeah, lots of great people
Hello.
here.
Goodness.
I'll just say thank you all for being here, and stay present. Hope to see you again soon. Bye all.
Thank you.